Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, John Craig, the author of The Ku Klux Klan in Western Pennsylvania, 1921 to 1928.
John Craig, author of The Ku Klux Klan in Western Pennsylvania, 1921 to 1928. How much of the popular image of the Ku Klux Klan matches up with the reality of it?
Well, I think most people's knowledge of the Ku Klux Klan comes from the more recent Klan, particularly the Klan of the Civil Rights era or the Reconstruction era Klan, the original Klan. They probably know less about the 1920s Klan, and yet that was the most powerful, largest Klan. So I would say probably most people don't know that much about the 1920s Klan, and they know more about a reincarnation of that Klan, the, say, 1950s, 1960s Klan, or they know about the original Night Riders of the Reconstruction era. So I think it's valuable that they do know about the 1920s because it was a larger organization. It had great influence in places like Pennsylvania. So they should know about that, but they probably know less about the 20s than they do about the 60s or the 1870s.
How big a deal was it in Pennsylvania in the 20s? Well,
it's pretty big. I mean, the overall numbers in Pennsylvania were 300,000. Those numbers are pretty close to accurate. They're based on Klan records. They're based on the Klan's own accounting, and they didn't fake them because there was money involved. So those numbers reflected money that went to different places from the initiation fees. And so that 300,000 is probably pretty accurate. That doesn't mean there were 300,000 at any one time, because between 1921 or really 1922 and 1928, people came and went, or they came and they left and other people came. And so because it was, you did pay an initial initiation fee if you were a Klan member, but you also had to pay yearly dues. And some people stopped paying the dues, no longer in the Klan. So it wasn't a for life kind of thing. So probably there were no more than maybe 200,000, maybe a bit more than that at any one particular time, maybe in late 1924, 1925. And 2/3 of those were in the western part of the state. They were much more influential, much larger numbers in western Pennsylvania than in eastern Pennsylvania.
What did it mean to be a member of the Klan? If you were in it, what did you do?
Well, there were lots of activities that the Klan was involved in. They did change over time, as I dealt with in the book, even though we're looking at a fairly small period of time, 21 or 22 up to 28. But when you joined, you also had to buy a robe and hood. They cost $6 at the time in the 1920s. It was actually the profit went directly to the national organization. And they were worn at events, and those events would be official kinds of initiation ceremonies or rallies. Certainly they paraded. Sometimes they paraded through their own hometown. Sometimes they joined others elsewhere. Sometimes they paraded in areas where a lot of Catholics lived so that there would be some conflict or at least a show of force. They traveled to large rallies in other parts of the state, usually though also in western Pennsylvania, maybe into Ohio. They had monthly meetings, sometimes weekly meetings. So they did meet quite a bit. They were a lodge as well as political organizations. So they met periodically, especially of course in the winter months, because you don't like marching around outside in February in western Pennsylvania if you can help it, right? So there were those kinds of activities. They were involved in some charitable activities.
You say in the book they were chartered in Pennsylvania as a charitable and patriotic organization.
Yes, because that was the easiest thing to do to give them certain rights. And if they certainly weren't going to say, we're a vigilante group and we're, we hate Catholics, Jews and blacks. In fact, was revealed in a pretty well-known court case that basically the judge decided they were not a charitable organization and they really were not living up to their to the charter. But yes, that's true. And they were involved in some charitable activities. They gave money to churches and they gave flags to schools. So they were involved in some of that. It wasn't necessarily what was really important about being Klansmen, but nonetheless, they were involved in a lot of activities, and a lot of those activities were secretive. They did wear not just the robes, but hoods, and they had visors with the hoods, and a lot of activities required keeping the visors down. So not just sort of secretiveness and mysteriousness, but protecting their identities, and anonymity was an important part of being a Klansman. It was part of the appeal, right, of being a Klansman.
Did everybody sort of know who the members were?
Some places that was true, that it was known, and sometimes people, some people belonged to the Klan were quite open about it. They'd be parading sometimes in regalia and have the visors down, but then they'd say hi to friends and lift the visors up. So yeah, it depended. Now some people didn't want it known, and again, as I dealt with in the book, that was really the greatest danger to the Klan, was that the veil of secrecy was broken. The anonymity for many of the members was shattered. They needed anonymity, it seems, to maintain their numbers and to increase their influence. So.
Well, your front cover picture has a lot of Klan's members with no masks.
That's right.
So they knew there was a camera there.
That's right. And that picture is from 1925. And in 1925, there had been a shift in policy with less wearing of visors, less confrontational activities, in part because confrontational activities in 1923 and 1924 had led to two major riots, and there had been some other riots, nearby, for example, in Ohio, and the Klan began to shift its behavior a bit, its policies a bit, which, by the way, did not help membership as it turned out. But yeah, you're exactly right that by 1925 you see more of that. But in 1922, 1923, 1924, you do not see a lot of images of the Klansmen with their visors not down. With their visors were usually the hoods and the visor part of the hood. They wore those because they did want to maintain anonymity.
Well, your book starts in 1921. Is that when the Klan started in Pennsylvania?
The very first chapter, it seems, appeared in Greensburg late in the year 1921. 1922 was really the year of the first cross burnings and the beginnings of the membership drive, but there was certainly the initial activity in 21. The King Kliegel, as he was called, the chief recruiter for Western Pennsylvania, there was also one for Eastern Pennsylvania, but the one who worked in Western Pennsylvania, his name was Sam Rich. He arrived in the fall of 1921, and he opened an office in downtown Pittsburgh, and at first secretively. There was a sign that said something like advertising on the door, but he appeared here in 1921, and the first groundwork was laid in that year. But 1922 was really the year that you have the first cross burnings, Johnstown, Altoona area by February or so, Allegheny County by March and April.
How did they recruit?
Well, the recruitment techniques are very effective. This is really, really explains the timing. You say, well, 1921, and why do I begin in 1921? Because in 1920, after the Klan had existed for about 5 or 6 years, it had been sort of refounded by William J. Simmons in 1915. Didn't really go very far. By about 1920, or right around that time, certainly by the end of 1919, there were about 5,000 members, and they were mainly in Georgia, a few in Alabama. It really had gone nowhere. But in 1920, he hired an organization called the Southern Publicity Association. And it was run by individuals named Clark and Tyler. Tyler was a woman, Elizabeth Tyler. And Edward Clark was the name of her partner. And they developed a technique for marketing the Klan, kind of modern sales techniques in a lot of ways. And what they did was they began to hire. Hire is kind of a loose term for this, but to gather together, maybe I should put it, recruiters who were known as Kliegels, and sent them not just throughout the South, but eventually into the Midwest, into the Southwest, into the Northeast, and various places. Now, they didn't actually pay them a salary, but they got a significant amount of the initial fee. It was called a collect token of $10 with K. Almost everything's with a K, right? They received $4 out of that original 10, each recruiter. So they made their money on a piecemeal basis, right? I mean, they got $4 for each new recruit once that recruit paid the $10, plus the money for the regalia, which the recruiters didn't get. And so they would, fan out, and they had, Klan literature and certain things they focused on. And then their goals, and, here you could talk about Western Pennsylvania. It would be the same if they were in Indiana. It would be the same if they were in New Mexico. It would be the same if they were in California or even Alabama. They would show up kind of unannounced in a community. Could be a city, could be a little town, could be a rural area. It'd show up unannounced and start to make some connections with local leaders. Ministers, Protestant ministers would be on that list. Local politicians, heads or leadership from lodges, Masons, for example. And they would meet with them. Some would be interested, probably some not. They would try to find out who might be interested once they begin to develop that network. They would try to get some of those people to join the Klan, pay the initiation fee, look to organize a so-called clavern, also with a K, which was that was a local lodge, was a clavern. And so they would start top down. They would not hold meetings initially, public or even private meetings, just one-on-one or small groups, and look to get that kind of leadership. And then try to convince some of those people to themselves work locally as Kliegels. So they relying on people to join the ranks of the recruiters. That's what happened in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, there's realization here in Western Pennsylvania that, that outsiders needed not just the support of locals. They needed those people to take the lead. Not that the others wouldn't make some money on this. They were looking to make money, the outsiders, especially early on. But they had to find people who had connections. They had people that had certain credibility. Some of them were salesmen. The first two individuals in Western Pennsylvania that Sam Rich hired really as Kliegels they had background in sales and were interested in the Klan and had been they joined in 1921 and began recruitment after that. And so they already had some connections, and they could connect with people because they were from the region, and they would certainly make that clear. And they would start traveling around a bit, and then find it was really a kind of try to develop the network, find other people who would want to be Kliegels in the towns and communities and the cities. And ultimately, once they got to that stage, they looked to have public meetings, and they would hold public meetings where they would just advertise. Local newspapers.
Or ads in the papers saying
ads in the papers, placards up on poles, some word of mouth. And in that case, they'd have a fairly prominent speaker give a pretty, innocuous kind of speech about, general goals of the Klan. And it could be in a theater, it could be in a lodge hall, it could be in a school, it could be in a church. They often tried to find churches where they could have in there, not in the pews, but in their meeting halls. Sometimes out in the woods, sometimes in a barn. Wherever they could get a place and have these so-called open meetings. But more importantly, what they also did is they distributed cards to people who they thought were potential members. And these were, and they set up so-called closed meetings. And at those meetings, they were not as vague about their goals. They would often talk about their platform in terms of being overtly anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-black.
You say in your book they were primarily an anti-Catholic organization.
That's true. In Western Pennsylvania, it was true.
Was there a lot of Catholics in Western Pennsylvania
yes.
at the time?
So, the couple decades leading up to the 1920s, actually more than that, but you'd had just incredible growth of population in the United States and in Pennsylvania. In 1900 there were a little more than 75 million people living in the United States. There were about a little over 6 million living in Pennsylvania. Well, by 1920 those numbers had gone up to 105 million, and in Pennsylvania almost 9 million. that's about a 40% or more increase, and a large percentage of that were immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and they were from Catholic areas. And so you had this really huge increase in population in the United States, in Pennsylvania, in particularly Western Pennsylvania, from Italy, from Poland, from Slovakia, from places where people were in fact Catholic. The Pittsburgh Diocese, which included actually not just Allegheny County, but the 9 counties around it, estimated that about 25% of the population in 1920, or maybe it was a couple of years after that, 25% were Catholic. Now that doesn't mean they all went to church, but I mean that means that they were of Catholic background, and they came from those areas. So you had a large influx of Catholics in this area. There were certainly places that there were not a lot of Catholics, in some of the more rural counties, but certainly around Allegheny County and into Westmoreland and Blair and Indiana and those counties, had a large Catholic population.
So when the Kliegels were trying to recruit, what was their pitch? I mean, they'd say, John, you should join the Klan. This is why. This is what we want to do.
And, let's face it, the main impetus, now, the anti-Catholic, anti-Black, anti-immigrant, agenda, I mean, it was a part of it, but a lot of it had to do with immigration restriction, because there was a movement already underway to restrict immigration in the United States. And of course, where would they be restricting but from those areas in Southern and Eastern Europe? So they talked about immigration, they talked about, and often they were very exaggerated, but the growing power of Catholics and the Pope, determining policy in the United States and that sort of thing. But also, of course, prohibition, because prohibition, begins in 1920, and the supporters of prohibition tended to be Protestants. Didn't mean some of them weren't hypocrites and they were drinking. Of course, it was true, but the Protestant majority in this area or in the country tended to favor prohibition. The Catholic minority from those places that I mentioned, and you throw the Irish into that mix too, they didn't buy into the idea of prohibition. And besides, they knew it was aimed at them, because there were a lot of hypocrites, let's face it. There were a lot of, the Hardy White House had alcohol in it from the beginning, right? And there were a lot of local clubs that legally actually had liquor, because if they stockpiled it before 1920, they could keep it. And so a lot of people stockpiled it, and so they were drinking. There was a lot of drinking going on, but they didn't want the working class, and especially the sort of immigrant working class, doing the drinking. So there was a lot of hypocrisy there. So they would talk about prohibition. They would certainly talk about white supremacy. They would talk about various moral reforms as well. They saw, increased industrialization, urbanization impacting the family, and so they did talk about those things as well. They actually talked about a lot of so-called planks that many people would have agreed with at the time. It wasn't so much that the basic ideas of the Klan, whether if they were talking about immigration or if they were talking even about race, would have been out of step with the majority of the population. It was their tactics that people were opposed to. It was the law breaking, even though they claimed to be in favor of law and order. It was the law breaking. It was the vigilantism. It was the often hatred associated with their attitude towards Catholics and immigrants and blacks and Jews.
I want to read something here. You say, start off the book. 1922, the people of Monongahela witnessed the first cross burning, and it was the fiery apparitions were a signal and warning to bootleggers and gamblers that the Klan had been duly organized and would take action against violators of the class.
Right.
And you think of them as being anti-African-American and anti-Catholic, but here they were taking on the bootleggers and the gamblers.
The thing is that the bootleggers and the gamblers were often associated with those immigrant groups, at least in the minds of many people. But that was a statement made by the local newspaper, and so I'm not going to say that that's code, but there are people are lined up, right, in certain certain perspectives that they have, and so you can see that prohibition is already in the mix there, and that's 1922. That's 2 years after prohibition has gone into place, but already people know that it is being widely ignored in many places, and in fact in many areas openly. Now, in that year, Pennsylvania elected a governor, and one of the major planks of Gifford Pinchot was the support of prohibition. He was himself a teetotaler, and he was genuinely committed, almost radically committed to prohibition. And so it was, an important part of political planks even at the time. And so the state police were running around breaking up a lot of, speakeasies and places like that in Pennsylvania. But there was still a lot of illegality, right, going on too.
Was membership in the Klan thought to be respectable?
I think that varies, from place to place. Even within, Western Pennsylvania, people wouldn't be hiding their identities if they thought that everybody would be embracing it. But there certainly would be support beyond the actual membership. There would be opposition as well, even among Protestants. We don't want to be, pretending here or, falsely, placing the brush of the tainted brush on every Protestant. Because some people, again, focusing on Klan hatreds and also the image of the Klan in the Reconstruction era, which did not have a particularly positive image. I mean, there were lynchings and other very violent acts associated with the Reconstruction era Klan, and this 20s Klan in many ways was modeled after that. So people would automatically be rejecting ideas of the Klan, and certainly the intelligentsia, newspaper editors in large numbers, magazine editors, they were very skeptical of the Klan. And but there were lots and lots of individuals who, in fact, had quite a bit of status. I mean, it was. At least one member of the state legislature was a Klansman openly, a Klansman. The mayor of Wilkinsburg was a Klansman openly, a Klansman. And so there, legitimacy, there was an element of that, especially at first, I would say.
So the Ku Klux Klan first started, as you said, during Reconstruction in the 1870s, and that organization ceased to be?
It did. It was, partly because of efforts by the federal government. The Klan Act and other legislation banned its activities, and it was involved in a lot of illegal, violent activities. And it did certainly help usher in the Jim Crow era. So it was successful in that way. And of course, after 1876, basically Southern whites were back in control of the government, and you have, Jim Crow well entrenched within the next few years in the South, and you might say that the Reconstruction Klan had done its job. And it disappeared. I mean, it was virtually gone. There were little enclaves here and there, people who still associated themselves with the Klan, but that was quite limited. I mean, it virtually did not exist. And that's, again, what William J. Simmons looked to reestablish it. He really was reestablishing it virtually from scratch in 1915.
Well, you say in your book that it was the movie Birth of a Nation that sparked the resurgence?
That's correct. The first feature-length film made by an American director, D.W. Griffiths, glorified the Klan, the Reconstruction-era Klan, and it showed them, riding around and burning crosses, which, by the way, the Reconstruction-era Klan never did. They didn't burn crosses.
They didn't?
No, that actually came from the Klansmen, which was a book by Thomas Dixon that was popular, that the Birth of a Nation was based on. It was based on that novel. And in that novel, Dixon had, Klansmen burning crosses in the Reconstruction era, but they didn't do that. They burned down barns and people's houses, but they didn't burn any crosses. And so it was a fiction. It was actually a novel fiction. Yes, it was actually adopted from the novel by Simmons. Because the very first thing he did when he revived the Klan, just as the Birth of a Nation was opening in Atlanta, he got 15 of his charter members to make their way up on Stone Mountain. He had dragged the cross up there himself, and they burned a cross on top of Stone Mountain to commemorate the opening of Birth of a Nation, which showed burning crosses. But that was when it began. That burning crosses was something that Simmons began in 1915. And as I said, it didn't really go very, very, very far at that point, but there was a lot of burning of crosses in Western Pennsylvania in the early 1920s.
Well, it sounds like from your book, some of these crosses were pretty big.
Eventually, I don't know if you noticed that, but they got bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, I have accounts in there of 50-foot crosses, 70-foot crosses. They just kept getting bigger and bigger. As the rallies got bigger and they were looking for more excitement for the membership, they burned massive crosses, and they were. And Western Pennsylvania has like the perfect topography for burning crosses. Stick them on top of a hill, and people can see them for miles around.
I want to ask you about something about, you have a couple of attacks that the Klan made on people, and one was 1922, William Hollingsworth, they took him from his home, shaved off half of his mustache, cut the hair on the side of his head, branded the letter K on his forehead. Klan officials lectured Hollingsworth on the poor care he was affording his mother, whom he left in the attic unattended. And then there was another member they severely beat because he was mistreating and being unfaithful to his wife.
Right.
Those aren't the kind of things you associate the Klan with.
Right. The Klan, as you see elsewhere in the book, especially after that first year, they targeted people. They targeted African Americans. They targeted Catholics. They targeted people for various reasons. But the Klan agenda also included moral reform. And it's actually not surprising that they did some of that first, because that would add an air of legitimacy, right? More people are going to accept that. If you show up at the home of, a black farmer because he's black, well, some people would be, would not look at that as so favorably. But if it's a guy who's got his mother locked in the attic, that's a lot easier to justify. So yeah, some of the very earliest ones. I mentioned that because it's really sort of the first forays that I have evidence of anyway into vigilantism. Now they were predisposed in that direction, but they didn't really. Really it was that really begins happening in large measure in 1923 and 1924. The Vigilante Acts in larger numbers.
You also say in the book the group claimed to support the Constitution, not law-breaking, but men in office must enforce the law or get out.
Yeah, right.
So they saw themselves as defenders of the Constitution?
Yes, there was obvious hypocrisy in that, as many newspaper editors and others saw. But so they would say we don't support law-breaking, but yet they would take law into their own hands. So, which is vigilantism. It is law-breaking. So, it was one of many contradictions in the Klan. I mean, the organization was formed in many ways based on contradiction, and that was one of them. Is that and they often tried to phrase that. They tried to massage that in a way that where they said, well, we're forcing politicians out of office, and sometimes they even said, well, we'll do it through the ballot. But they didn't always say they did it through the ballot. They tried to force people out in any way they could, and so. Yeah, they used law-breaking to support, law-abiding behavior or whatever. I mean, it was contradictory. It was hypocritical. But
how often would they do something? How often would there be an incident that the Klan decided we'll target this person or this
right?
group?
Well, first of all, that is the area of research that is most difficult to determine. When people break the law, they have this habit of not keeping a record of it, right? And in the 1930s, political science, a PhD student named Emerson Laux, interviewed a lot of Klansmen after really the Klan had virtually disappeared in western Pennsylvania. And he interviewed a lot of Klansmen for a dissertation and ultimately a book that he wrote, and which was based quite a bit on interviews with Klansmen. And he said that basically that the Klan said that it happened in virtually every clavern. And there were 200 of them in western Pennsylvania. So some of the evidence on that doesn't exist. In fact, he didn't even recount very much in the book because, the people he was talking to were either saying, look, you can't put this in there, or they just wouldn't tell him. Now, there were some examples that are in there, and I do mention some of those, and some of them I could find in newspapers. But a lot of that, that was not something that was covered in the newspapers. So, I had to uncover as much as I could. It's probably the tip of the iceberg. If, Laux, from talking to a lot of Klansmen, determined that all of the 200 claverns were doing it, well, then he's probably not exaggerating it. So it did happen. Did it happen every week? Did it happen every month? Did it happen all the time? Did it happen in all the claverns? No, it didn't. And in fact, many scholars of the Klan, do characterize the Klan, I think, somewhat falsely that. Well, they really weren't that violent an organization because, they only did these things part of the time. But to me, that's kind of the same argument of saying a serial killer is not really a murderer because he only kills people once in a while. They only were involved in vigilante acts part of the time. They certainly did other things that were confrontational and led to riots and other, mayhem. But just because, the vigilante acts don't happen every week, or even every month, doesn't mean they're not vigilantes. So it happened a lot. I think that's what I would say.
How often did they target African Americans? And if they targeted somebody, what did they do?
Okay, well, they did target African Americans, and in fact, many of the very first forays into fairly dramatic vigilantism the targets were black. Even though the population of African Americans in Western Pennsylvania was quite small, even in Pittsburgh, less than 10%, Allegheny County, only 4.5%, even in the surrounding counties to Allegheny, only 3 to 5%. So it was a fairly small population. But you could get away with that because, first of all, who was the most powerless group of all groups in Western Pennsylvania? It would be African Americans. Less likely to report anything, any actions taken against them. But nonetheless, not just easy targets, but targets that would satisfy the membership. Because let's face it, white supremacy was a part of it. So there's a couple of episodes that I describe in the book. There was a farmer who lived in near Burgettstown, in a rural area near Burgettstown, and he managed a farm that was owned actually by a middle-aged white woman. In fact, he lived in the same house with his family. He had a wife and children. They lived in the same house with this woman. And this occurred in 1923. Knock on the door late at night. He kind of lives in the middle of nowhere outside of Burgettstown. Goes through the door. He's got a gun, right? And two guys standing there, and they're wearing civilian clothing, and they say their car went into a ditch. He was skeptical. They're in the middle of nowhere. But nonetheless, he invited him into his house. He told his son to go get the mule there and see if they could pull the car out. Well, with that, they grabbed his gun. And so he makes his way quickly up the stairs right behind the entrance there and grabs a shotgun. It happened to be unloaded, and goes into a room, locks the door. And 20 Klansmen come in behind the two, and they go up the stairs. And by that point, as they're heading up the stairs, the owner of the house comes out, and she confronts them. What are you doing in my house? That sort of thing. And they explain to her that that they are there because they heard that he had been cheating her out of money, and cheating other farmers and out of money in the area in transactions. And besides, he shouldn't be living in the same house with her, with, of course, his family. And she says, well, none of those things are true. He is living in the house here. His family lives in the house. It's a big house. They live over there, and I live down here. Anyway, she convinces him to open the door. And he's got a shotgun there. And they go inside, 20 Klansmen or so. They go inside, and they're standing on one side of the room, and he's standing on the other, near the window. And they tell him that he's got 5 days to vacate the area. This is an area he'd lived for 30 years. The last, I don't know how many years, 10 years or 12 years or something, living in that house, managing that farm. And so as they press a little bit closer to him and he sees that they are not listening to reason, he basically pushes open the window, jumps out. He knows where he's going. He jumps out onto the porch roof, jumps down into a cornfield, and hides. They can't find him. They go back out. They go out there, but it's his farm, right? They can't find him. They're tramping down the corn, but it's late summer. The corn's high. They can't find him. So he makes his way about 10 miles to a train station, takes a train, goes to Pittsburgh, actually, and goes to police headquarters in Pittsburgh and tells them what happened. Now, he was in Washington County, not Allegheny County, and the chief of detectives says, yeah, this sounds bad, but I got to call. I can call the state police, and I'm going to call the Washington officials, and so he does that. And he tells them and promises from the return phone calls from Washington County authorities that they will investigate that. So he goes back home. And the investigation starts. Local Washington officials, state police don't get involved. They're too busy chasing after prohibition violators, apparently. And there's reports in the newspapers. The Pittsburgh papers pick up this story. They carry it quite a bit, actually, for the next few days, but so does the Washington paper. And they report that they confirm that, people were tramping down the corn, that they believe there were people there, and the local detective looking at it says, they were Klansmen, and they were Klansmen, and he knew the identities of some, and arrests were imminent, right? Well, a few days later, arrests do happen, but of the black farmer and the woman who owned the house. Not for the Vigilante Act, but for the immorality of him living in the same house. And he's arrested, and he's thrown in jail. She was not thrown in jail. He eventually pleaded guilty to immorality. That was a crime, immoral act. and spent 6 months in the county workhouse for living in that house. No criminal proceedings against the Klan, which was the norm. I mean, almost any vigilante act, that was the case. So if that was somebody who, maybe was not black, maybe a Catholic priest, there might be proceedings against the Klan, right, in that one. They could get away with it because, let's face it, the victim, mainly in that case, was black. Now, the woman who owned the house paid a fine as well, but no jail time. She paid a $25 fine, which, by the way, was a lot of money at that time, but she paid a fine. That was it. But, what the Klan did was not considered illegal. They just barged into somebody's house and threatened them.
You mentioned riots that took place at some Klan rallies, and you say that the Grand Dragon, Sam Rich, who you referred to, often said in his office that it takes the riots to swell the ranks of the Klan. What was a Klan riot like?
Well, first of all, the reason that he said that was that the Klan increased its membership to the rather lofty numbers that it had, that eventually 300,000 in the state, 200,000 or so in western Pennsylvania, though not all at the same time, but pretty large numbers, right? Because, not just of the ideas of the Klan, but because of what the Klan did or what they promised to do. And they were, they characterized the organization as one that was committed to action. Action taken against their enemies. And their enemies certainly included Catholics. Their enemies included AfricanAmericans. Their enemies included prohibition, people who were violating prohibition. There were various enemies, right, that they were.
You list them in the back. They were the Jewish, Celtic, Mediterranean, and Alpine peoples.
Yes, that comes directly from Klan literature, right? In that order, right? Exactly, yeah. And so those are their enemies. They were not shy about using that term, and so it was taking dramatic action against those groups that that's what really built their ranks more than anything else. My book is more about actions, things people did, not what people thought, and so the organization had to live up to that. And one of the most exciting things that they could do, right, was not just go burn a cross someplace, but burn a cross on someone's lawn, and the element of intimidation and threat associated with that, or to parade in areas where lots of Catholics lived. And they did that in various instances. They liked to march by a Catholic church. They liked to march in areas where they knew they would have individuals who would not be in agreement with them, in fact, would be targets of their wrath. And this gave participants the opportunity for the excitement, right, associated with that. Not just the mysteries of the Klan wearing robes and secret handshakes and watching spectacular pyrotechnics or something like that, or going out in the middle of the woods or on a hill or something and burn a cross, but to actually march, with the visors down. And of course, that happened in Carnegie and that happened in Lilly, Pennsylvania, in two massive riots where these were direct challenges to the Catholic population of those places. And when the Klan marched in those areas at night, by the way, they knew perfectly well that there was going to be conflict. Now, did they know that people would be shot? Did they know people would die? You can't necessarily argue that, but you knew that there would be serious confrontation when Sam Rich, the King Kleagle and Grand Dragon of Pennsylvania, or even in the case of Carnegie, because the order was given by the Imperial Wizard, the head of the Klan at that time, whose name was Hiram Wesley Evans. Simmons had been pushed out of the order before then. And Evans gave the order to do it. He knew what was going to happen when they marched into Carnegie that had a population that was half Catholic and had a lot of Irish, including the mayor of the city was a person of Irish descent. They knew what was going to happen.
So when the riots occurred, it was the locals attacking the Klan and not the Klan attacking locals? Well,
you shouldn't really say that, because really in the second case in Lilly, it was more of the Klan attacking the locals. They opened fire on them. But in the Carnegie episode, there were 25,000 Klansmen who gathered on a hill outside of Carnegie in August of 1923, and they decided to march through Carnegie, and they actually crossed. They didn't cross in the spot that they initially were going to cross, but they went across the Chartiers Creek, right near a Catholic church, and in an area not far from where a lot of Irish people lived. And they wanted to march in that area anyway. They wanted to march in a way that would be confrontational. And so they got to this bridge spanning the Chartiers Creek. There's a bridge there today. It was new one was built in 1926, but there's a bridge that's similar to that today. And they got to this bridge, and there were all these townspeople on the other side, and they were armed with bricks, and they were armed with clubs, and they were prepared for the Klan to come in. And there was a standstill at the bridge. And county authorities, county detectives, county police, local police presence was there. They tried to prevent the conflict from occurring, but eventually the order was given by the Klan leadership that they would march across the bridge. And there were about 3,500 marchers, and not all of them got across the bridge, only a minority did, but they came across the bridge, and at that point the conflict began. And it was a rather brutal hand-to-hand combat kind of situation as the Klan tried to make their way up very narrow streets there. And so there were shots fired. Klansmen were certainly firing most of the shots, though many of them were probably being fired in the air. People were hit on both sides, but the only fatal shot was killed a Klansman. And again, no one really knows who fired that shot. I mean, it could have been fired by a Klansman. No one really knows. But certainly some townspeople were armed as well, though the Klan tended to come armed to these. They're the ones who usually had a lot of the guns. In Lilly the next year, there was an episode where they, also marching at night, locals turned a fire hose on them as they were reboarding the train after a march through the city and after they burned some crosses. And at that point, a shot rang out. It may have been fired, probably was actually fired by a local person, and a Klansman was shot. And then just generally, I mean, hundreds of Klansmen opened fire on innocent townspeople, including children, and not too many women were on the street right there at that time, but they shot at least 25 people in a one-sided gun battle. So that would certainly not be something where you could, say the townspeople, were really responsible.
Well, you do quote some townspeople as saying, "Boys, get your gun and kill them." One report hearing among countless verbal attacks. Eventually, the assault turned physical with the cry of, "There are some of the yellow-backed Protestant sons of bitches."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They were confronted by antagonistic townspeople marching through their town. A town that was about 80% Catholic, Irish, Italian.
Where is Lilly?
Lilly is actually about 20 miles from Altoona. It's not far from Hollidaysburg. So it's a railroad town in the mountains, and mainly mining at the time, and it had a very large Catholic population, again, majority population of Catholics, and it was chosen for that reason. There had been some incidents there, and the Klan had great difficulty burning crosses there because every time they tried to burn a cross, they got run out of town.
Were there trials as a result of that?
There were trials, and actually some Klansmen got off, but I think 15 Klansmen were found guilty and actually served about a year of jail time for inciting what technically they didn't call a riot, but an affray. And some townspeople, about a dozen townspeople, also were found guilty. They were actually tried together as a group for the riot. No one, however, was found guilty of murder, and in fact, only one Klansman was even charged, and he was the guy who was shot at the fire hose, and so he clearly did not shoot a weapon. So Klansmen they got away with shooting people and killing. They killed 3 people and wounded quite a few in Lilly.
Who were the Knights of the Flaming Circle?
The Knights of the Flaming Circle.
Quite a name.
It is, yeah. In mid-August of 1923, people in Kane, in southern McCain County, saw, out in actually a bit of a rural area, they saw this flaming ring that was burning railroad fuses up here in a meadow, and then reports letters to local newspapers, and they announced themselves originally as the Knights of the Blazing Ring, and then later, within a short time, Knights of the Flaming Circle, an anti-Klan organization that was open to all members who wanted to join unless they belonged to the Klan. So it was open to African Americans, it was open to Catholics, it was open to Jews, it was open to anybody who was an opponent of the Klan. And chapters did apparently pop up. There's not a great deal of surviving records on this, but there were a lot of apparently branches of this. There were some violent confrontations in Ohio involving the Knights of the Flaming Circle. There were some in Illinois as well, but clearly there was evidence of local chapters of these, and sometimes they would burn their ring right after the Klan had burned a cross. There are reports of that in the same exact spot. So there was the threat there of opponents, and the thing is, the more popular the Klan became, the more opposition that also emerged, and it emerged in that form, and it emerged in some other forms as well.
Did you find much press coverage that was favorable toward the Klan?
There certainly was some. You can identify some newspapers that clearly were gathering information from Klansmen themselves. They'd include a lot of promotional information about the local Klan activities. They would advertise events. So that the Altoona paper was like that. One of the Johnstown papers was like that. The Newcastle.
And they clearly said
paper.
Ku Klux Klan.
Oh yeah, they did that. They advertised in local newspapers.
Did you go through a lot of microfilm to find
I did.
these?
In fact, that was a very time-consuming process because, for the most part, it was just looking through edition after edition after edition. Because a lot of that is not digitized. There's a limited amount of digitized holdings in newspapers. So, for example, the Pittsburgh papers that I went through, they weren't generally not digitized. I'm just this for years doing that. I did look at. I wanted to get newspapers that basically had covered all 25 counties that I focused on in Western Pennsylvania. So I looked at a lot of newspapers and I did find a lot about the Klan. And one advantage of doing that, by the way, the K is not a typical letter that you see, especially on a front page. And eventually, you become attuned to looking for the K. So, made it easier to do my searches.
And then there was something called the Imperial Nighthawk.
The Imperial Nighthawk was yes, that was the official organ. It was a weekly. The weekly newspaper of the Klan. It was mainly a promotional thing.
Nationally or in Western Pennsylvania?
Nationally, and it was distributed locally.
What kind of reading does that make?
Well, it had a lot of coverage of local activities. That was what the Imperial Nighthawk was mainly designed to do, was to be distributed to local membership. And it covered activities in Western Pennsylvania. It covered extensively the Carnegie Riot. It did not cover Lilly very much. You didn't really want to cover the one-sided gun battle.
Did the Klan get involved in politics, running candidates?
Yeah, they did not. In Western Pennsylvania, it was very limited. It wasn't that they didn't support candidates. They did. They were more concerned about the image of having political power than actually enjoying it. Sometimes they would actually wait till the last minute and simply endorse somebody who was going to win, and they figured it was going to win. The Republican Party dominated local politics at the time virtually everywhere, and so they tended to support Republicans. And sometimes there were different, there were primary contests that were hotly contested, and they would pick, certain candidates. They would sometimes, secretly put things in people's mailboxes or put up placards. But they did track politics fairly carefully. They used, techniques of, they used detective work. They gathered information about local candidates. They wanted to know everything about candidates. They wanted to know about potential candidates. They certainly wanted to know their religion, but they wanted to know their views. They wanted to know their background, and they actually, kept track of that. It was the role actually of local claverns to keep a record of local politicians and what they stood for and what they did, and most importantly, what their religion was. And sometimes their focus would simply be to try to defeat Catholics.
There's somebody I want to ask you about, and that was the mayor of Johnstown, Joseph
Yes.
Coffield.
Yeah.
You say he told a reporter for the Johnstown Democrat that he was ordering the immediate removal from Johnstown of every Negro who has not been a local resident for at least 7 years.
Yes.
and black residents of the city were prohibited from holding public gatherings, and all African American visitors were instructed to report to the police or mayor's office.
Yes.
That was his rule while
That was, yes.
And the Klan endorsed him, Mike?
Well, yes, actually, he did that, he claimed, in response to the fact that the Klan was burning crosses all over the place at that time, because what had occurred, he had actually been out of town at that time, and what had occurred was that there was a shooting in an area that was occupied by African-American workers. And the local newspaper said, it was a moonshine-crazed, African-American worker who opened fire on police and killed 3 of them. And they caught the guy immediately, but the police did. But rumors spread that there were other, African-American residents who were arming themselves, and that there were going to be other actions taken. And so the Klan, which was very powerful in that area anyway, started burning a bunch of crosses. And so Coffield claimed that he was actually looking to protect those individuals. Of course, that was totally illegal. I mean, he could not do that, but he ordered it, and other local officials did not actually contest that, because they actually were worried about violence. He ended up not getting the nomination anyway. He was involved in some scandals. I want
to read one of them, just
go
to another facet of this gentleman. During a water shortage in Johnstown in August of 1922, he told local brewers to begin producing beer in defiance of the Volstead Act prohibition.
Even though he claimed he supported the Volstead Act, because there was a problem with the quality of water at that time, and so that got a lot of attention. It was actually it was called the Johnstown Flood of Beer. In newspapers throughout the country. And again, he had some kind of a convoluted argument that he was really just trying to demonstrate that local law enforcement wasn't doing a very good job in defending the Volstead Act, and he was just showing it. At the same time, there was a water shortage. That was a very odd thing. So he was a very flamboyant guy. And actually, he would get reelected mayor at one time, but he also ended up in jail. So at one point for corruption.
So what caused the Klan to decline then?
The decline of the Klan, there's a lot of reasons for it, but really the primary reason it declined, particularly in Western Pennsylvania, which is what I know about, was that in light of the riots, in light of publicity surrounding other vigilante acts, its opponents became more strident in their efforts to damage the Klan. And their opponents realized that the Klan needed secrecy. It certainly needed secrecy for vigilante actions. And it needed secrecy if you're going to shoot down people in Lilly, because one reason why no Klansmen were ever indicted for murder there was that no one knew who they were. They either had visors down. Actually, it was also dark at the time. It was nighttime. So it was hard to identify any Klansmen. Even the number of Klansmen that were even indicted for the riot was very small, because they couldn't identify very many of them. And so anonymity was important. And so their opponents started taking action to prevent them from marching with visors on. And there were local ordinances that did that. Some places around the country, actually, it was banned that they could march with their hoods and visors on. Also, their names were published in newspapers. There was an organization called the American Unity League. They would get the names of Klansmen by breaking into their offices and publish them in their journal, which was called Tolerance. One of the Erie papers, the Erie Times. They found the license plate numbers of Klansmen. They spied on them, and then they published their names in the paper. They were able to secure some other Klan records, and they published the names of Klansmen, and that could actually be very damaging. So, also dangerous, for vigilantes. And so it was actually in response to that, and also into response to another really violent riot that occurred just across the border in Ohio, in Niles, the infamous Niles riot, where many Pennsylvania Klansmen were there, that the national organization began to pull back from not all vigilante acts, and certainly not all parading, but they began to limit it extensively, beginning in 1925. And absent, just to put it simply, absent the thrills, absent some of the mystery, absent the ability for some, Klansmen to be involved in intimidation and in some cases outright violent actions. The Klan began to melt away. Now, there were other reasons.
I have to ask you about, there was a lawsuit where the national organization sued the Pennsylvania organization
right.
for what? For copyright of the use of the name
yes,
Ku Klux Klan?
That actually happened after the Klan had basically disintegrated anyway, but there were still some Klansmen left. That occurred in 1927. There were a few thousand, maybe 10,000 left, out of the 300,000 at that point in the entire state. And what happened in that infamous case, which actually was tried right here in Pittsburgh, was that the National Klan decided, after banishing a number of prominent members in Western Pennsylvania over conflicts about leadership, that they would try to secure all the monies that they had collected that those Klaverns had by actually doing away with the entire Klavern and also banishing some of its leadership. They decided that they would sue them and try to get looking for financial gain. But among the people that they named was actually a very prominent attorney and a member of the state legislature, and they fought back. And they actually won in court, and in the process revealed many of the violent actions of the Klan that had occurred, not just in Western Pennsylvania but elsewhere, but primarily in Western Pennsylvania. And that included the Lilly Riot, the Carnegie Riot, some kidnappings, a variety of other episodes that they were able to reveal that the Klan didn't even contest. I mean, they fought back, but they didn't even contest it because you had actually Klansmen arguing against Klansmen, or maybe former Klansmen arguing against Klansmen. And they both knew what had happened. They were participants, or they were certainly aware of it. So it was difficult for Klan leadership or the Klan lawyers to basically say in cross-examination, oh, wait a minute, hey, that didn't happen. They knew that the people that they were talking to knew that it had happened. So put them in a difficult position.
Is this your first book?
This is not. This is actually the first book I had done in quite a while, but I had written on the American peace movement before that point, which looks at violence in different ways, right? But it was a turn towards a new subject. I had actually written about the Klan in Virginia way back in the 1980s, but I turned to this subject as really a new topic for me. It's one reason why it took me a long time to do it.
Well, we are out of time. We've been speaking with John Craig. He is the author of this book, The Ku Klux Klan in Western Pennsylvania. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.